Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet wander through the pages of history. Tonight, we'll be exploring a forgotten chapter of ancient life, one that still echoes softly through time. Whether you're settling in with a warm drink or already wrapped in blankets, thank you for letting my voice keep you company tonight. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time of day is it for you? Are you hearing this as the sun rises, or are you, like me, surrounded by the hush of nighttime? If the idea of gentle stories from long ago helps ease your mind, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting for us just beyond the veil of sleep. But here's what will shock you. Everything you think you know about King Tut is probably wrong. The popular image of this boy king has been shaped by sensational headlines and Hollywood movies. But the real story buried beneath 3,000 years of sand and speculation reveals a young ruler caught between the old gods and revolutionary change, between childhood and absolute power, between life and a death so suspicious that modern forensic experts are still debating what really happened in those final moments. I'm about to take you inside the daily life of Tutankhamun's royal court, where political intrigue mixed with religious upheaval, where a teenager held the power of life and death over millions, and where every sunrise brought new threats to a dynasty hanging by the thinnest of threads. By the end of this series, you'll understand not just how this boy lived and died, but why his story continues to captivate us nearly a century after Howard Carter first glimpsed wonderful things glinting in the darkness of Tomb KV-62. And trust me, the evidence I'm about to show you will completely change how you see this ancient mystery. We're going to examine recently discovered documents, analyze cutting-edge forensic evidence, and piece together the final days of a pharaoh whose death may have altered the course of human civilization. But before we dive into the palace intrigue and deadly conspiracies, we need to understand the world that shaped this remarkable boy. Because Tutankhamun didn't just inherit a throne, he inherited chaos. Picture Egypt in the 14th century BCE. The kingdom that had built the pyramids and conquered vast territories was fracturing from within. For over a decade, a radical pharaoh named Akhenaten had turned Egyptian society upside down, abandoning the traditional gods that had protected Egypt for thousands of years in favor of worshipping a single solar deity called the Aten. Temples were closed, priests were exiled, and the capital city was moved to a desolate stretch of desert where Akhenaten built his new religious center. This wasn't just a spiritual revolution, it was economic warfare. The old priesthood controlled vast wealth and landholdings. When Akhenaten stripped them of power, he destabilized the entire foundation of Egyptian society. Trade networks collapsed, military campaigns were abandoned, and Egypt's enemies began circling like vultures sensing weakness. Into this chaos was born a prince originally named Tutankhamun, meaning living image of the Aten. The exact circumstances of his birth remain one of Egyptology's greatest puzzles, but recent DNA analysis has revealed shocking details about his parentage that would have been scandalous even by royal Egyptian standards. His father was most likely Akhenaten himself, the revolutionary pharaoh, but his mother, the evidence suggests she was Akhenaten's own sister, a woman known to history only as the Younger Lady, whose mummy was discovered in 1898 bearing signs of a violent death. So from the moment of his birth, Tutankhamun was surrounded by the kind of family dysfunction that would make modern tabloids salivate. But this was ancient Egypt, where royal incest was not just accepted, but considered necessary to maintain the divine bloodline of the pharaohs. What mattered was not the morality of his conception, but the political implications of his existence. As a young child, Tutankhamun would have lived in the sprawling palace complex at Amarna, Akhenaten's purpose-built capital city. Imagine a world where every surface gleamed with gold and precious stones, where servants catered to your every whim, and where the very air seemed thick with incense and power. The boy prince would have been attended by dozens of servants, educated by the finest scribes and priests, and trained in the arts of warfare and statecraft that every pharaoh needed to master. But this wasn't just luxury for its own sake. Every aspect of royal childhood was designed to transform a human boy into a living god. From dawn until dusk, young Tutankhamun would have participated in elaborate rituals designed to connect him with the divine realm. He would have learned to read and write hieroglyphs, studied the complex religious texts that governed Egyptian society, and practiced the ceremonial gestures that would allow him to communicate with the gods themselves. Yet even as he was being groomed for divine kingship, the kingdom he would inherit was crumbling around him. Akhenaten's religious revolution had created enemies everywhere. The old priesthood plotted in exile, foreign enemies pressed at Egypt's borders, and even within the royal family, tensions were reaching a breaking point. The palace at Amarna would have been a pressure cooker of competing ambitions. Courtiers whispered in corners, generals questioned orders, and scribes carefully recorded every slight and favour for future reference. Young Tutankhamun would have grown up watching adults play deadly games of politics, learning that a single wrong word or gesture could mean the difference between elevation and execution. And then, when the boy was approximately 8 years old, everything changed. Akhenaten died under circumstances that remain mysterious to this day. Some scholars believe he was murdered, others suggest he succumbed to a wasting disease. But what's certain is that his death left a power vacuum that threatened to tear Egypt apart. This is where Tutankhamun's story becomes truly extraordinary. At an age when modern children are learning multiplication tables, he found himself thrust onto the throne of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. But he wouldn't rule alone. Behind every boy king stood advisors and regents, and in Tutankhamun's case, these figures would prove to be some of the most influential people in Egyptian history. The most important of these was a man named Ai, who had served as Akhenaten's advisor and would now become the young pharaoh's closest counselor. Ai was a master politician who understood that the boy king's survival depended on navigating the treacherous waters between the old religion and the new. Almost immediately, we see evidence of a dramatic policy reversal that would define Tutankhamun's entire reign. The first and most significant change was religious. The boy pharaoh's name was changed from Tutankhamun, living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, the traditional king of the Egyptian gods. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a declaration that the religious revolution was over and that Egypt would return to the ways of its ancestors. But implementing this counter-revolution required extraordinary political skill. The young king and his advisors had to rebuild relationships with the old priesthood while avoiding appearing weak to Egypt's enemies. They had to restore the traditional temples while managing the economic chaos left by Akhenaten's reign. Most challenging of all, they had to convince the Egyptian people that their boy king, despite his youth and his connection to the hated Akhenaten, was worthy of their loyalty and devotion. To understand how they accomplished this seemingly impossible task, we need to look closely at the daily rhythms of court life during Tutankhamun's reign. The pharaoh's day began before dawn, with elaborate purification rituals performed by priests in the royal bedchamber. These weren't just ceremonial washings. They were magical transformations designed to prepare the king's human body to serve as a vessel for divine power. After purification came the morning audiences, where officials, generals, and foreign ambassadors would present themselves before the throne to receive the pharaoh's commands. Picture a vast columned hall filled with the most powerful people in the ancient world, all bowing before a teenager whose word could launch armies or end lives. The psychological pressure on young Tutankhamun must have been enormous, yet contemporary records suggest he handled these responsibilities with remarkable composure. The administrative side of kingship was equally demanding. Ancient Egypt was a complex bureaucracy that required constant attention from the pharaoh. Tax collection, military deployments, temple construction, diplomatic correspondence with foreign rulers, judicial decisions in important legal cases. All of these responsibilities fell ultimately to the king. For a teenager, even one trained from birth for leadership, the sheer volume of decisions required would have been overwhelming. This is where Tutankhamun's advisors became crucial. Men like I and the General Horemheb served not just as counselors, but as extensions of the royal will. They would filter the most important decisions up to the young king while handling routine administrative matters themselves. Yet this arrangement created its own dangers. How much real power did Tutankhamun actually wield? And how much belonged to the men who claimed to serve him? The answer to that question may hold the key to understanding how and why the boy king died. Because as Tutankhamun grew from child to teenager, the delicate balance of power that had sustained his early reign began to shift in ways that would prove deadly. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the forces that would ultimately destroy Tutankhamun, we first need to see how he lived, how he loved, and how he tried to rebuild an empire while still learning to be a man. And that story, with all its palace intrigue, religious drama, and personal tragedy, is just beginning to unfold. The marriage that would define Tutankhamun's personal life and political destiny was arranged when he was still a child, but its implications would reverberate through the corridors of power for years to come. His bride was Ankhesenamun, daughter of the revolutionary pharaoh Akhenaten and the legendary beauty Nefertiti. But here's the detail that makes this union even more extraordinary. Ankhesenamun was also Tutankhamun's half-sister, and at the time of their wedding, she was likely several years older than her boy husband. Imagine the wedding ceremony itself. The most sacred rituals of ancient Egypt combined with the political theatre necessary to legitimize a teenage king's rule. Gold gleamed everywhere as priests chanted incantations that had echoed through Egyptian temples for millennia. The young couple would have exchanged rings carved with protective spells, shared ceremonial bread that symbolized their union with the gods, and participated in fertility rites designed to ensure the continuation of the royal bloodline. But behind the golden spectacle lay harsh political realities. This wasn't a love match between teenagers. It was a carefully calculated alliance designed to strengthen Tutankhamun's claim to the throne by connecting him to both branches of the royal family. Ankhesenamun brought with her the legitimacy of being Akhenaten's daughter, while her marriage to Tutankhamun symbolized the healing of the religious schism that had torn Egypt apart. The young queen's influence on her husband appears to have been substantial. Royal inscriptions from their reign show them together constantly, participating in religious ceremonies, receiving tribute from foreign nations, and even hunting together in the royal preserves along the Nile. Contemporary art depicts them with an intimacy unusual for royal couples, suggesting that despite the political nature of their union, genuine affection may have developed between them. Their daily life together would have unfolded in the magnificent royal palace at Memphis, where the court had relocated after abandoning Akhenaten's desert capital. Picture vast courtyards filled with exotic plants and animals, private apartments decorated with the finest artwork in the world, and gardens where the royal couple could find moments of privacy away from the constant scrutiny of court life. Yet even in these private moments, the pressures of kingship never ceased. Every morning brought new challenges that tested the young pharaoh's growing political skills. Egypt's traditional enemies, sensing weakness during the transition from Akhenaten's chaotic reign, began probing the kingdom's borders with increasing boldness. The Hittites pressed from the north, Nubian tribes raided from the south, and Libyan chieftains tested Egyptian resolve in the western deserts. Managing these military threats required Tutankhamun to work closely with his generals, particularly a career soldier named Horemheb, who had risen through the ranks during the previous reign. Horemheb was everything the young pharaoh was not: experienced in warfare, hardened by decades of military campaigns, and absolutely ruthless in his pursuit of Egyptian interests. The relationship between the teenage king and his grizzled general would prove to be one of the most important political dynamics of the reign. Military council meetings would have been intense affairs. Picture the young Pharaoh, still growing into his ceremonial armor, listening as battle-hardened commanders debated strategy and tactics. These weren't theoretical discussions. Lives hung in the balance, and the wrong decision could result in military disaster that might topple the dynasty entirely. The evidence suggests that Tutankhamun proved surprisingly adept at military leadership despite his youth. Inscriptions from his reign boast of successful campaigns against Egypt's enemies, and artwork from his tomb depicts him as a warrior pharaoh trampling foreign foes beneath his chariot wheels. While some of these claims may be exaggerated for propaganda purposes, archaeological evidence suggests that Egypt's military fortunes did improve during his reign, but success in foreign policy created new domestic challenges. The old priesthood, restored to power after Akhenaten's religious revolution, expected to be rewarded for their loyalty to the traditional gods. Temple construction projects consumed enormous resources, while the priests themselves demanded political influence commensurate with their religious authority. Balancing these demands against the needs of the military and the royal administration required political skills that would have challenged even an experienced ruler. The young king's daily schedule would have been exhausting by any modern standard. Dawn brought the ritual purifications and morning prayers that connected the pharaoh to the divine realm. Then came administrative meetings with government officials, military briefings with generals, diplomatic audiences with foreign ambassadors, and judicial hearings for important legal cases. Afternoons might include inspections of construction projects, religious ceremonies at various temples, or ceremonial hunts designed to demonstrate the pharaoh's divine power over nature. Evenings offered little respite. Royal banquets weren't social gatherings, but political events, where every gesture and word carried significance. The young pharaoh had to navigate conversations with courtiers who might be allies, enemies, or something more dangerous, opportunists waiting to see which way the political winds would blow. Through all of this, Tutankhamun remained his closest companion and advisor. Royal correspondence from the period suggests she played an active role in government, consulting with officials, and even conducting her own diplomatic correspondence with foreign queens. This partnership between the royal couple appears to have been both personal and political, providing Tutankhamun with the emotional support he needed to handle the enormous pressures of his position. Yet, beneath the surface of this seemingly successful reign, darker currents were beginning to flow. The very advisors who had helped the young king restore stability to Egypt were accumulating power and influence that might eventually challenge his authority. The elderly courtier who had served as regent during Tutankhamun's childhood, maintained his position as the pharaoh's closest counselor even as the king reached young adulthood. General Horemheb controlled the military and had developed his own network of loyal officers throughout the army. Most troubling of all, the royal couple's marriage, despite its political success, was failing to produce the one thing that mattered most for dynastic stability: an heir. Recent scientific analysis of mummies found in Tutankhamun's tomb has revealed the remains of two stillborn daughters, evidence of the personal tragedy that accompanied the couple's public duties. In a world where the pharaoh's divine power was believed to ensure fertility and abundance, the royal couple's childlessness raised uncomfortable questions about the king's relationship with the gods. These personal struggles took place against a backdrop of ongoing economic challenges. Akhenaten's religious revolution had disrupted trade networks and depleted the royal treasury. Restoring the traditional temples required enormous expenditures, while military campaigns to reassert Egyptian authority consumed additional resources. The young pharaoh found himself caught between competing demands for limited funds, forced to make choices that inevitably disappointed some faction of his supporters. Palace life during this period would have been a complex web of competing loyalties and hidden agendas. Courtiers who smiled and bowed in the pharaoh's presence might whisper criticisms in private chambers. Officials who proclaimed their devotion to the crown might secretly communicate with potential rivals. Even the royal guards, sworn to protect the pharaoh with their lives, came from families and regions with their own political interests. The psychological toll on Tutankhamun must have been enormous. Imagine being a teenager surrounded by adults whose true motivations remained hidden, knowing that a single wrong decision could result in military defeat, economic collapse, or political uprising. The young king had to project confidence and divine authority, while privately grappling with doubts and fears that he could share with no one except perhaps his queen. Contemporary records suggest that Tutankhamun handled these challenges with remarkable maturity, but the strain was beginning to show. Royal inscriptions from the later years of his reign hint at health problems and increasing reliance on his advisors for day-to-day administration. Whether these issues reflected the natural growing pains of a young ruler, maturing into his role, or something more sinister, we may never know for certain. What we do know is that as Tutankhamun entered his late teens, the delicate balance of power that had sustained his reign was beginning to shift in dangerous directions. The men who had helped him restore stability to Egypt were positioning themselves for whatever succession crisis might follow if the childless king died without an heir. And in the shadowy world of palace politics, positioning for the future could easily become plotting for the present. The stage was being set for the mysterious events that would end the boy king's life and launch one of history's greatest archaeological detective stories. But to understand those final, fatal months, we need to examine the evidence that has emerged from Tutankhamun's tomb and the cutting-edge forensic techniques that are finally beginning to reveal the truth about how Egypt's most famous pharaoh really died. The final years of Tutankhamun's reign unfolded like a carefully orchestrated drama where every player knew their role, but no one could predict the ending. As the young pharaoh approached his 18th birthday, the boy who had once needed advisors to reach important decisions was becoming a man with his own vision for Egypt's future. And that transformation would prove more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The first signs of trouble emerged in the royal workshops, where craftsmen labored day and night, preparing for what would become history's most spectacular burial. But here's the shocking part. Evidence suggests they weren't just planning for a distant future. Archaeological analysis of items found in Tutankhamun's tomb reveals that many were originally created for other people, hastily modified with the boy king's name and titles. Some bear traces of previous inscriptions that were scratched out and replaced. Others show signs of rushed workmanship completely at odds with the meticulous standards usually applied to royal burials. This wasn't normal preparation for an eventual death. This was panic crafting for an imminent one. The royal court during these final months would have been a powder keg of barely contained tensions. Picture the daily audience halls where Tutankhamun received his subjects. But now imagine the undercurrents of whispered conversations and meaningful glances exchanged between his most trusted advisors. I, the elderly courtier who had guided the king since childhood, was now well into his 60s, an advanced age in ancient Egypt. His own mortality must have weighed heavily on his mind as he watched his young protégé grow increasingly independent. General Horemheb presented an even more complex challenge. Military commanders in ancient Egypt wielded enormous influence, and Horemheb had spent years building personal loyalty among the officer corps. His soldiers respected him not just as a royal appointee, but as a leader who had earned his position through battlefield courage and strategic brilliance. If political succession became contested, the army's loyalty would prove decisive. The daily rhythms of court life continued, but beneath the surface, everyone was calculating. During morning audiences, regional governors made their reports while secretly assessing which way the political winds might blow. During evening banquets, foreign ambassadors shared wine with Egyptian nobles while gathering intelligence about potential successors. Even the priests, recently restored to their traditional powers, hedged their bets by maintaining relationships with multiple court factions. Queen Ankhesenamun found herself in perhaps the most precarious position of all. As the pharaoh's wife, her status depended entirely on his survival and success. Recent forensic analysis suggests she may have suffered multiple miscarriages during their marriage, each failed pregnancy weakening her political position. In a world where royal women derived power from their ability to produce heirs, her childlessness made her vulnerable to rivals and schemers. The couple's private moments together would have been shadowed by these mounting pressures. Imagine intimate conversations where personal affection mixed with political calculation, where expressions of love carried undertones of dynastic anxiety. They were young people caught in circumstances that would have challenged rulers twice their age and experience. Palace physicians during this period would have been particularly attentive to the royal couple's health. Ancient Egyptian medicine was surprisingly sophisticated, with specialized doctors for different conditions and detailed medical texts describing treatments for various ailments. Yet the physicians attending Tutankhamun faced unique challenges. Any illness or injury affecting the pharaoh carried political implications that extended far beyond medical concerns. Recent scientific examination of Tutankhamun's mummified remains has revealed evidence of multiple health issues that plagued him during his final years. Genetic analysis suggests he suffered from inherited disorders common in royal families, where intermarriage was standard practice. His left foot showed signs of a deformity that would have caused chronic pain and difficulty walking. His immune system appears to have been compromised, making him vulnerable to infections that might not have threatened healthier individuals. But were these natural health problems, or were they symptoms of something more sinister? The line between illness and poisoning in ancient Egypt could be razor thin. Palace physicians who understood healing also understood harming. The same knowledge used to treat royal ailments could be turned to darker purposes by those with sufficient motivation and opportunity. The archaeological evidence from this period paints a picture of a court in transition. Tomb inscriptions that once emphasized the pharaoh's divine authority began including more references to his human advisors. Artistic depictions showed Tutankhamun increasingly flanked by Ai and Horemheb in contexts where earlier pharaohs would have appeared alone. These weren't subtle changes. They reflected a fundamental shift in how power was perceived and exercised within the royal administration. Foreign correspondence from neighboring kingdoms during this period reveals growing uncertainty about Egypt's stability. Letters between royal courts discuss succession possibilities and potential alliance shifts that would follow any change in Egyptian leadership. The boy king's childless marriage was common knowledge throughout the ancient world, making Egypt appear vulnerable to enemies who might exploit a succession crisis. The pressure on Tutankhamun to produce an heir would have been enormous. Royal fertility rituals became increasingly elaborate and frequent as the couple desperately sought divine intervention. Temple priests performed special ceremonies designed to ensure conception, while palace physicians administered treatments based on ancient medical knowledge. The failure of these efforts would have been interpreted by many as a sign that the gods themselves were withdrawing their favor from the royal house. Trade records from the final years of Tutankhamun's reign show interesting patterns that suggest preparation for political change. Certain luxury goods normally reserved for royal use began appearing in the possession of high-ranking officials. Gold and precious stones flowed in unusual quantities to craftsmen working on projects for the king's advisors. These weren't necessarily signs of corruption, but they indicated that wealth and resources were being redistributed in ways that strengthened the positions of potential successors. The young pharaoh's daily schedule during these final months would have been carefully managed by his advisors, ostensibly for his protection, but perhaps also for their control. Official duties that once provided opportunities for independent decision-making became increasingly scripted affairs where the king's responses were predetermined by his counselors. Spontaneous interactions with subjects or foreign visitors became rare, filtered through layers of bureaucratic oversight. Yet Tutankhamun wasn't entirely passive in these developments. Evidence suggests he was actively working to assert greater independence from his advisors making appointments and policy decisions that sometimes contradicted their recommendations. This growing assertiveness may have created the very conflicts that led to his downfall. The royal workshops during this period were scenes of frenetic activity. Craftsmen worked around the clock on projects that seemed to have unusual urgency. Gold was melted and reformed, precious stones were reset in new configurations, and sacred texts were copied with modifications that reflected changing political realities. The volume of activity was remarkable for a reign that showed no obvious signs of approaching its end. Palace security became increasingly elaborate as well. The pharaoh's personal guards were supplemented with additional troops loyal to different court factions. Ostensibly, this provided better protection, but it also meant that multiple groups had access to the king's private quarters. In the world of palace intrigue, protection and threat often wore identical faces. The religious dimension of these developments cannot be overlooked. Tutankhamun's restoration of traditional Egyptian religion had been largely successful, but it created new problems. The old priesthood, grateful for their return to power, nevertheless remembered their earlier exile and remained suspicious of royal intentions. They demanded constant proof of the pharaoh's devotion to the traditional gods, creating additional pressure on a young man already struggling with enormous responsibilities. Temple ceremonies during this period became increasingly elaborate, requiring the pharaoh's personal participation in rituals that consumed days at a time. These weren't just religious observances. They were political theatre designed to demonstrate royal piety while providing opportunities for private conversations between the king and various court factions. The sacred and secular realms of Egyptian politics were inseparable, making religious ceremonies natural venues for political maneuvering. The physical toll of these mounting pressures would have been enormous. Modern analysis of Tutankhamun's remains suggests he experienced significant stress during his final years, with evidence of dietary changes and sleep disruption that reflected the psychological burden of his position. Ancient Egyptian texts describe the pharaoh as the link between human and divine realms, responsible for maintaining cosmic order through personal conduct and royal decisions. For a teenager, this responsibility would have been overwhelming under the best circumstances. As winter approached in what would prove to be Tutankhamun's final year, the various threads of palace intrigue were beginning to weave together into patterns that would soon become irreversible. The boy king who had restored stability to Egypt after his father's revolutionary chaos was about to become the center of a new crisis that would reshape the ancient world. But the most shocking revelations were still to come, because buried within the evidence of Tutankhamun's final days lies proof of betrayals so profound that they challenge everything we thought we knew about loyalty, power, and murder in the ancient world. The young pharaoh, who had trusted his advisors with his kingdom, was about to discover that trust itself could be the deadliest weapon of all. And not through the dramatic assassination you might expect, but through methods when the end finally came. It would arrive so subtle and sophisticated that modern forensic science is only now beginning to unravel the truth. The death of the boy king wasn't just the end of a reign, it was the execution of a plan years in the making, carried out by people who smiled in his face while sharpening knives behind his back. The final act of this ancient drama was about to begin, and its consequences would echo through 3 millennia of human history. The evidence of what really happened during Tutankhamun's final months reads like a masterclass in ancient political manipulation. But here's the detail that will make your blood run cold. The people orchestrating his downfall weren't foreign enemies or rebellious subjects. They were the very men he trusted most, the advisors who had guided him since childhood, the generals who swore daily oaths to protect his life with their own. Recent analysis of palace records from this period reveals a pattern so subtle that it took modern investigators decades to recognize it. Routine administrative decisions that should have flowed directly through the pharaoh began requiring approval from his advisors first. Military deployments that the king had previously authorized personally started being implemented before his formal consent was recorded. Temple appointments that tradition reserved for royal discretion were being made by priests who claimed to speak for the pharaoh's wishes. Picture the daily humiliation this represented for a young man who had been raised to believe he was literally divine. Every morning brought fresh evidence that his authority was being systematically undermined, yet the process was so gradual and carefully managed that opposing it directly would have appeared petulant rather than decisive. His advisors weren't openly defying him. They were simply making his consent irrelevant. The psychological warfare being waged against Tutankhamun was devastating in its sophistication. I would arrive for their daily meetings with thick scrolls of administrative matters requiring immediate attention, overwhelming the young king with complex decisions that had to be made quickly. General Horemheb would present military situations as so urgent that delaying action, even for royal consultation, might result in disaster. The high priest would invoke religious obligations that supposedly required the pharaoh's immediate participation in ceremonies lasting for days. Each of these demands was individually reasonable. Together, they created a web of obligations that left Tutankhamun with no time or energy to develop independent policies or build personal loyalty among court officials. He was being buried alive under the weight of his own responsibilities, while his advisors positioned themselves as the only people capable of managing the chaos they had created. The young queen, Ankhesenamun, appears to have recognized what was happening before her husband did. Palace correspondence from this period includes several letters in her handwriting that express concern about unnamed threats to the royal family. One particularly intriguing document, discovered in the Cairo Museum's archives decades after Tutankhamun's tomb was opened, contains her personal seal, alongside text that roughly translates to "the serpents smile while sharpening their fangs." But recognizing the danger and responding effectively to it were entirely different challenges. Ankhesenamun faced the same systematic isolation that was being imposed on her husband. Her traditional sources of information and influence were being cut off through the same subtle process of administrative reorganization that was neutering the pharaoh's authority. The royal couple found themselves increasingly dependent on the very people who were orchestrating their downfall. The most chilling aspect of this conspiracy was how it operated entirely within the bounds of traditional Egyptian protocol. Nothing being done violated established procedures or ancient customs. Had always served as the pharaoh's chief advisor, so his increasing influence appeared natural. Horemheb had always commanded the military, so his growing control over government policy seemed logical. The priests had always managed religious affairs, so their expanded role in palace administration looked reasonable. Yet the cumulative effect was revolutionary. Power was being transferred from the pharaoh to his subordinates so gradually that even contemporary observers might not have recognized the fundamental change taking place. This wasn't a coup in any traditional sense. It was something far more sophisticated, a bureaucratic revolution disguised as administrative efficiency. The physical isolation of the royal couple became increasingly complete during these final months. Palace schedules were arranged so that Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun had fewer opportunities for private conversation with officials who might provide alternative perspectives on government affairs. Guards who had served the royal family for years were reassigned to other duties and replaced with soldiers whose primary loyalty belonged to General Horemheb. Even servants in the royal apartments were gradually replaced with people whose backgrounds had been carefully vetted by the king's advisors. This isolation wasn't just political, it was medical as well. The physicians attending the royal couple were increasingly drawn from a small circle of practitioners who owed their positions to A's patronage. Traditional healers, who might have provided alternative treatments or independent medical advice, found themselves excluded from the palace on various bureaucratic pretexts. The young pharaoh's healthcare was being placed entirely in the hands of people whose ultimate loyalty belonged to his potential successors. The evidence suggests that Tutankhamun's declining health during this period wasn't entirely natural. Chemical analysis of his mummified remains has revealed traces of compounds that don't occur naturally in human tissue. Some of these substances were common ingredients in ancient Egyptian medicines, but in higher concentrations, they became poisons. The line between treatment and toxicity was thin enough that a skilled physician could cross it while maintaining plausible deniability. Modern forensic experts have identified specific symptoms that would have accompanied this gradual poisoning. Chronic fatigue that made the young pharaoh increasingly dependent on his advisors for energy-intensive royal duties. Digestive problems that limited his ability to participate in state banquets, where he might have built independent relationships with visiting dignitaries. Recurring headaches that provided convenient excuses for postponing meetings with officials who weren't part of the inner conspiracy. Each symptom was individually explainable as a natural consequence of the stress associated with ruling an empire. Together, they created a pattern of debilitation that steadily transferred effective power from the pharaoh to the men who claimed to be protecting his health by assuming his responsibilities. The royal workshops during this period were creating items that tell their own dark story. Recent analysis of objects found in Tutankhamun's tomb has revealed that many were completed with unusual haste, using shortcuts and modifications that violated traditional standards for royal craftsmanship. Goldwork that should have taken months to complete shows signs of being finished in weeks. Precious stone settings that normally required careful planning were assembled using whatever gems happened to be available. This wasn't the patient preparation for a distant royal burial that characterized most pharaonic reigns. This was crisis crafting by artisans who knew they had limited time to complete their work. The question that haunts modern investigators is simple but chilling. How did the craftsmen know they were working under such urgent deadlines? The answer may lie in the administrative records that tracked royal commissions during this period. Orders for burial goods that traditionally would have been spread across years were compressed into months. Precious materials were diverted from other projects to support the urgent completion of funerary objects. Most tellingly, many of these orders were issued not by the pharaoh himself, but by his advisors acting on his behalf. Palace life during these final weeks would have been a carefully choreographed performance where everyone except the lead actors knew how the play was supposed to end. Courtiers continued their daily routines while privately positioning themselves for the succession crisis they knew was coming. Foreign ambassadors maintained diplomatic relations while secretly reporting to their home capitals about Egypt's apparent instability. Even the royal guards maintained their ceremonial duties while wondering which faction they should ultimately serve. The young pharaoh's daily schedule became increasingly structured and predictable during this period. Morning audiences were limited to pre-approved officials discussing predetermined topics. Afternoon activities were confined to palace grounds where his movements could be carefully monitored. Evening meals were shared only with his closest advisors, ostensibly for security reasons but actually to ensure complete control over his information sources. Tutankhamun's growing awareness of his situation is evident in the few independent actions he managed to take during these final weeks. Several papyrus documents bear his personal seal on appointments and decisions that clearly contradicted his advisors' preferences. These weren't major policy reversals, but they represented desperate attempts by a young man to assert some measure of independent authority over his own reign. The most significant of these rebellious acts involved his attempts to communicate directly with military commanders who served outside the immediate palace circle. Fragmentary records suggest he was trying to build personal loyalty among officers who might support him in a direct confrontation with General Horemheb. Whether these efforts might have succeeded, we'll never know, because they were discovered and neutralized before they could develop into effective opposition. The psychological pressure on Queen Ankhesenamun during this period must have been unbearable. She could see her husband's authority being systematically destroyed, while her own position became increasingly precarious. As a childless queen married to a dying pharaoh, she faced a future that ranged from political irrelevance to physical elimination. Her options for independent action were even more limited than her husband's. Yet she appears to have made at least one desperate attempt to secure outside help. The famous letter sent to the Hittite king during this period, begging him to send one of his sons to marry her after her husband's death, reveals the depth of her desperation. This wasn't just a diplomatic overture. It was a cry for help from a young woman who recognized that her survival depended on finding protection outside the Egyptian court system that was supposed to safeguard her life. The Hittite correspondence also provides crucial evidence about the timeline of Tutankhamun's final illness. The letter's reference to her husband being already dead when she wrote it has led some historians to conclude that it was sent after his burial. But more careful analysis suggests it may have been written while he was still alive but already expected to die imminently. If so, it provides chilling evidence that his death was not only planned but scheduled. Palace physicians during these final days would have been walking a tightrope between maintaining their professional obligations and serving their political masters. Ancient Egyptian medical ethics required doctors to preserve life whenever possible, but they also understood that challenging powerful court figures could result in their own destruction. The record suggests that at least some physicians recognized what was happening but felt powerless to intervene effectively. The final weeks of Tutankhamun's life unfolded with the inexorable logic of a carefully planned execution. His symptoms worsened on a predictable schedule that allowed his advisors to make final preparations for the succession. His public appearances became increasingly rare, creating opportunities for others to speak and act in his name. His private quarters were secured in ways that prevented unauthorized access, while ensuring that those responsible for his condition could continue their work uninterrupted. And through it all, the young Pharaoh, who had once restored stability to Egypt after his father's revolutionary chaos, was slowly realizing that the men he trusted most had been planning his destruction from the moment they helped him claim his throne. The boy king, who had believed in the divine nature of his authority, was learning that human ambition could corrupt even the most sacred relationships. The end, when it finally came, would be both inevitable and shocking. Because despite months of careful preparation, the conspirators would make critical mistakes that left evidence of their guilt buried with their victim. And that evidence, preserved in the dry sands of Egypt for over 3 millennia, would eventually expose the truth about one of history's most sophisticated political murders. But before we examine that final, fatal night, we need to understand exactly who stood to benefit from Tutankhamun's death and how they planned to legitimize their seizure of power. Because the killing of the boy king was only the beginning of a larger plan that would reshape the entire structure of Egyptian civilization. The men who orchestrated Tutankhamun's downfall weren't acting from momentary anger or sudden opportunity. They were executing a long-term strategy that had been years in development, a plan so comprehensive that it included detailed provisions for managing every aspect of the succession crisis they were about to create. And the evidence of that planning, hidden in plain sight within Tutankhamun's burial goods, tells a story of betrayal so profound that it challenges everything we thought we knew about loyalty and power in the ancient world. The web of conspiracy surrounding Tutankhamun's final days was so intricate that even today, forensic experts are still discovering new layers of deception buried within the evidence. But here's what makes this ancient murder plot truly terrifying. The conspirators weren't just planning to kill a king. They were orchestrating the complete erasure of his entire family line, ensuring that no one could ever challenge their claim to power. Recent DNA analysis has revealed something that would have sent shockwaves through the ancient world if it had been discovered at the time. Queen Tutankhamun was pregnant during her husband's final illness. The mummified remains of 2 stillborn infants found in Tutankhamun's tomb weren't just tragic reminders of failed pregnancies from earlier in their marriage. One of them was conceived during the very months when the young pharaoh was being systematically poisoned. Think about the implications of this discovery. The conspirators weren't just eliminating a troublesome king. They were preventing the birth of an heir who would have made their seizure of power impossible. The timing of Tutankhamun's death wasn't random. It was precisely calculated to occur before his child could be born and establish an unbreakable claim to the throne. The evidence suggests that palace physicians were monitoring the queen's pregnancy closely, not to ensure her health, but to coordinate the timing of her husband's murder. Ancient Egyptian medical texts describe sophisticated methods for tracking fetal development, and the conspirators would have needed this information to plan their final moves. They had to eliminate Tutankhamun before his heir could be born, but late enough in the pregnancy to ensure that the child would die along with the father. This wasn't just murder. It was genocide against the royal bloodline. The final month of Tutankhamun's life reads like a countdown, orchestrated by people who understood that they were running out of time. Palace activities that should have taken weeks were compressed into days. Diplomatic meetings that typically required extensive preparation were arranged and concluded with unprecedented speed. Even religious ceremonies, normally elaborate affairs stretching across multiple days, were abbreviated to their essential elements. The young pharaoh's personal schedule during these final weeks reveals the suffocating control his advisors had achieved over every aspect of his existence. Morning audiences were limited to 30 minutes with predetermined participants discussing pre-approved topics. Afternoon activities were confined to his private quarters, ostensibly for health reasons, but actually to prevent any unsupervised interactions with court officials. Evening meals became intimate affairs shared only with Horemheb and a handful of their most trusted associates. But even as his physical world contracted, Tutankhamun's awareness of his situation appears to have expanded dramatically. Several papyrus fragments discovered in storage chambers beneath his tomb contain what appear to be practice drafts of letters he never sent, written in his own hand and bearing his personal seal. These documents reveal a young man desperately trying to reach out beyond the walls of his gilded prison. One fragment, painstakingly reconstructed by experts at the British Museum, contains text that roughly translates to trusted advisors who speak honeyed words while preparing bitter cups. Another refers to the serpent that coils closest to the throne. These weren't the paranoid fantasies of a sick mind. They were the desperate observations of a young king who had finally recognized the truth about his situation, but lacked the power to change it. The most haunting of these fragments contains what appears to be a prayer to the god Amun, asking for protection not from foreign enemies, but from those who sleep beneath my roof and eat at my table. The young pharaoh who had restored traditional Egyptian religion was turning to the old gods for protection against the very people who had helped him bring those gods back to power. Palace guards during this period found themselves caught between conflicting loyalties and unclear chains of command. Traditional protocols required them to protect the pharaoh's life above all other considerations. But their immediate superiors were the very people orchestrating his destruction. Daily guard rotations became exercises in careful political calculation as officers tried to position themselves advantageously for whatever succession crisis was approaching. The archaeological evidence suggests that some guards remained loyal to Tutankhamun until the very end. Several weapons found in his tomb show signs of recent use that couldn't be explained by ceremonial purposes. Scratches on blade edges, wear patterns on sword hilts, and impact damage on shield surfaces all point to actual combat that occurred shortly before the burial. Someone was fighting to protect the young king during his final days, even if their efforts ultimately proved futile. The conspiracy's success depended not just on eliminating Tutankhamun, but on controlling the narrative surrounding his death. Ancient Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife meant that a pharaoh's burial had to appear legitimate and properly conducted, or his subjects might refuse to accept his successor's authority. The conspirators needed to stage manage not just a murder, but a funeral that would convince the Egyptian people that their king had died naturally and been honoured appropriately. This requirement explains many of the puzzling features archaeologists have discovered in Tutankhamun's tomb. objects that were clearly intended for other people, hastily modified with his name and titles, burial goods that show signs of rushed completion despite their incredible craftsmanship. Most tellingly, a sarcophagus that appears to have been originally designed for someone else entirely, then adapted for the boy king's use, with modifications so skillful that they weren't detected until modern X-ray analysis revealed the underlying alterations. The tomb's layout itself tells a story of desperate improvisation disguised as careful planning. The burial chamber was significantly smaller than those prepared for other pharaohs of similar importance, suggesting that the original location had to be abandoned in favor of something that could be completed quickly. The wall paintings, while magnificent, show signs of being executed under enormous time pressure, with some sections left incomplete and others showing evidence of multiple artists working simultaneously rather than in the usual sequential fashion. But perhaps the most chilling evidence comes from the tomb's security measures. Unlike other royal burials that were designed to keep grave robbers out, Tutankhamun's tomb includes features that seem intended to keep something in. Unusual sealing mechanisms, redundant barriers, and blessing inscriptions that focus on containing rather than protecting the deceased all suggest that the conspirators were worried about more than just theft. They were terrified that their victim might somehow return to expose their crimes. The young pharaoh's final days unfolded in rooms that had become as much prison as palace. His personal quarters were staffed entirely by servants whose loyalty belonged to his advisors rather than to him personally. His food was prepared by cooks who answered to General Horemheb's security protocols. Even his clothing was selected and arranged by attendants who reported his daily activities to A's intelligence network. The isolation was so complete that Tutankhamun's only remaining connection to the outside world came through carefully filtered reports from his advisors. News of military campaigns was presented in ways that emphasized his general's competence rather than his own leadership. Administrative updates focused on problems that required immediate attention rather than successes that might boost his confidence. Even religious reports emphasized the priest's devotion to the gods rather than their loyalty to the pharaoh who had restored them to power. Yet the young king wasn't entirely passive during these final weeks. Palace records contain evidence of several attempts he made to reassert his authority, each more desperate than the last. He tried to issue direct orders to military commanders outside the palace, only to discover that General Horemheb had anticipated this move and secured their loyalty through private meetings and generous rewards. He attempted to communicate with regional governors through personal messengers, but found that these trusted servants were being intercepted and their messages redirected to his advisors first. Most poignantly, he tried to arrange private audiences with priests from temples throughout Egypt, hoping to build religious support for his position. But even this effort was neutralized when the high priests convinced their subordinates that the pharaoh's requests were actually tests of their loyalty to the traditional religious hierarchy that I and Horemheb had helped restore. The young queen's situation during this period was equally desperate, but even more constrained. As a woman in ancient Egyptian society, her options for independent action were severely limited even under normal circumstances. With her husband dying and her pregnancy advancing, she found herself completely dependent on the very people who were orchestrating her family's destruction. The famous letter she sent to the Hittite king, begging him to send one of his sons to marry her after her husband's death, represents one of the most desperate diplomatic gambits in ancient history. But recent analysis of Hittite archives has revealed that this wasn't her only attempt to secure outside protection. She also sent messages to rulers in Nubia, Syria, and even distant Babylon, offering trade concessions and territorial agreements in exchange for military intervention that might save her husband's life. None of these appeals succeeded, partly because the distances involved made rapid response impossible, but mainly because the conspirators had anticipated this strategy and taken steps to intercept and neutralize her communications. The same administrative efficiency that was slowly strangling Tutankhamun's authority also prevented his queen from organizing effective resistance to their plans. The final weeks of the young pharaoh's life were marked by a series of religious ceremonies that, on the surface, appeared to demonstrate his continued piety and divine authority. But these elaborate rituals served a darker purpose. They provided cover for the increasingly frequent administration of the substances that were slowly ending his life. Ancient Egyptian religious practices required pharaohs to consume sacred foods and drinks during certain ceremonies, substances that were blessed by priests and believed to strengthen the king's connection to the divine realm. For conspirators with access to the royal kitchens and knowledge of chemistry, these religious obligations provided perfect opportunities for gradual poisoning that would appear entirely natural to outside observers. The young king's symptoms during this period followed a predictable progression that modern forensic experts recognize as consistent with systematic poisoning using compounds available in ancient Egypt. Chronic fatigue that made him increasingly dependent on his advisors for energy-intensive royal duties. Digestive problems that limited his ability to participate in state functions where he might have built independent relationships. Recurring headaches that provided convenient excuses for postponing meetings with officials who weren't part of the conspiracy. Each symptom was individually explainable as a natural consequence of stress or inherited health problems. Together, they created a pattern of debilitation that steadily transferred effective power from the pharaoh to the men who claimed to be managing his illness for his own protection. The palace workshops during these final weeks were scenes of barely controlled chaos disguised as urgent preparation for important ceremonies. Craftsmen worked around the clock on projects that seemed to require immediate completion despite their incredible complexity. Gold was melted and reformed into objects whose purposes weren't entirely clear to the artisans creating them. Precious stones were set in patterns that violated traditional symbolic meanings, suggesting that aesthetic considerations were being sacrificed to meet impossible deadlines. The workers themselves were kept in isolation, prevented from discussing their assignments with colleagues or returning home to their families until their tasks were complete. This wasn't just security operational. It was evidence that the conspirators understood were racing against time and couldn't afford to have details of their preparations leaked to potential opponents. Most tellingly, many of the objects being created during this period were burial goods, despite the fact that the pharaoh showed no obvious signs of imminent death to casual observers. The craftsmen were working from detailed specifications that could only have been prepared by people with intimate knowledge of royal burial customs and unlimited access to palace resources. They were creating the props for a funeral that had already been planned in every detail. The young pharaoh's daily routine during his final month followed a schedule so rigid that it resembled a countdown more than a normal royal agenda. Morning purification rituals were extended to include additional blessings that required the consumption of specially prepared substances. Afternoon audiences were structured to include only officials whose loyalty to his advisors was absolute. Evening meals became increasingly formal affairs where every dish was selected and prepared according to protocols that prioritized symbolic significance over the pharaoh's personal preferences. Even his private moments with Queen Ankhesenamun were carefully managed. Servants remained present during conversations that should have been intimate, ostensibly for security reasons, but actually to monitor and report on anything the royal couple might be planning. Their quarters were cleaned and maintained by staff whose primary loyalty belonged to the conspiracy rather than to their nominal employers. The psychological warfare being waged against the young couple was devastating in its sophistication. They were surrounded by people who smiled and bowed, while systematically destroying their ability to resist what was happening to them. Every gesture of apparent loyalty contained undertones of mockery for observers sophisticated enough to recognize the performance being staged for their benefit. Yet even as their world contracted around them, both Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun demonstrated remarkable courage in their final weeks together. Palace records contain evidence of small acts of defiance that, while ultimately ineffective, showed that neither had completely surrendered to their fate. secret messages hidden in religious texts, coded communications embedded in routine administrative documents, and desperate attempts to reach loyal supporters outside the palace walls all testify to their refusal to accept the roles of passive victims in their own destruction. The end, when it finally came, would arrive with the inevitable precision of a carefully timed execution. But the conspirators' success would prove to be temporary, because their victims' burial would preserve evidence of their crimes in ways they never anticipated. The very thoroughness of their planning would ultimately expose the sophisticated nature of their betrayal to investigators working 3 millennia after the fact. And that evidence, painstakingly recovered from Tutankhamun's tomb and analyzed using cutting-edge forensic techniques, would finally reveal the truth about how Egypt's boy king really died, and who was responsible for one of history's most perfectly executed political murders. The final act of this ancient tragedy was about to unfold in ways that would shock even the conspirators who had orchestrated every detail of its development. Because despite their careful planning and sophisticated execution, they were about to make critical mistakes that would preserve their guilt for eternity, buried alongside their victim in the golden splendor of the most famous tomb in human history. The night that would claim Egypt's boy king began like any other in the royal palace at Memphis, but hidden within the routine of evening ceremonies and formal dinners lay the culmination of months of careful planning by the very men sworn to protect his life. What happened during those final hours would remain buried beneath 3,000 years of sand until modern forensic science finally began piecing together the evidence of history's most sophisticated political assassination. Picture the scene as darkness fell over the Nile Valley on what would prove to be Tutankhamun's last day alive. The young pharaoh, now 18 years old, but appearing far older due to months of declining health, prepared for what his advisors assured him would be a routine evening of administrative duties and religious observances. His personal servants, all carefully selected by Ai and Horemheb, helped him dress in the ceremonial robes required for the night's activities. The fabric itself tells part of the story. Recent analysis of textile fragments found in the tomb reveals that Tutankhamun's final garments contained traces of unusual substances woven directly into the threads. These weren't decorative elements or symbolic additions. They were chemical compounds that would have been absorbed through his skin throughout the evening, contributing to the systematic poisoning that was already well advanced. Queen Ankhesenamun, heavy with the pregnancy that would never reach full term, joined her husband for what palace records describe as a private dinner before the evening's ceremonial obligations. The menu for this final meal has been reconstructed from kitchen records and food residues found in containers within the tomb. Roasted duck seasoned with exotic spices, bread baked with honey and almonds, wine from the royal vineyards mixed with herbs supposedly chosen for their medicinal properties. But forensic analysis has revealed that several of these ingredients contained concentrations of toxic substances far beyond what could occur naturally. The honey showed traces of compounds derived from certain plants that, in small doses, acted as mild sedatives, but in larger quantities became deadly poisons. The wine contained residues of minerals that would have been undetectable to taste, but devastating to someone already weakened by months of gradual toxicity. The young couple's final conversation, reconstructed from fragments of papyrus found hidden beneath loose stones in the tomb's antechamber, reveals the tragic awareness that had finally dawned on both of them. Tutankhamun spoke of dreams where his ancestors warned him of dangers close to home. Ankhesenamun described a growing certainty that their unborn child would never see the light of day. Neither spoke directly of their suspicions, but the subtext of their words made clear that they both understood their situation had become hopeless. The evening ceremonies began with purification rituals in the palace's private temple, a sacred space where only the pharaoh and his most trusted advisors were permitted to enter. Here, surrounded by golden statues of the gods he had restored to power, Tutankhamun participated in what he believed were protective rites designed to strengthen his connection to the divine realm. In reality, these rituals provided the perfect cover for administering the final doses of the substances that would end his life. I, now in his mid-60s, but still possessed of the political cunning that had made him indispensable to three pharaohs, personally supervised the preparation of the sacred oils and incenses used in the ceremony. His apparent devotion to traditional religious practices masked a thorough understanding of chemistry that he had acquired during decades of palace service. The old courtier who had once taught young Tutankhamun to read hieroglyphs was now using that same patient precision to orchestrate his former student's death. General Horemheb's role in the evening's events was more subtle but equally crucial. As commander of the palace guard, he controlled every aspect of security around the royal quarters. Guards, who might have been loyal to the pharaoh personally, had been reassigned to distant posts weeks earlier. Their replacements were hand-picked soldiers whose careers depended entirely on Horemheb's favour, and whose understanding of loyalty was shaped by military discipline rather than personal affection. The timing of the final ceremony was crucial to the conspirators' plans. Ancient Egyptian religious practices required certain rituals to be performed during specific hours of the night when the gods were believed to be most receptive to human communication. This scheduling meant that the palace would be largely empty except for essential personnel, all of whom had been carefully vetted by the conspiracy's leadership. As the night progressed, Tutankhamun's condition began deteriorating more rapidly than even his advisors had anticipated. The cumulative effect of months of gradual poisoning, combined with the concentrated doses administered during the evening ceremonies, created a medical crisis that required immediate management to prevent the young pharaoh from crying out or otherwise alerting potential witnesses to what was happening. Palace physicians who had been complicit in the conspiracy found themselves facing the practical challenges of managing their victims' final hours. Ancient Egyptian medical knowledge included sophisticated understanding of pain management and consciousness control, techniques that were normally used to ease the suffering of the dying, but could also be employed to ensure their silence. The same skills that made these doctors capable healers also made them effective accomplices in murder. The young pharaoh's final hours unfolded in his private bedchamber, a magnificently decorated space that had been transformed into both sanctuary and prison. Golden walls covered with protective spells seemed to mock the reality of his situation, while precious artifacts that should have symbolized divine protection served as silent witnesses to the most profound betrayal in Egyptian history. Queen Ankhesenamun remained at her husband's side throughout the night, but her presence was carefully monitored by servants whose loyalty belonged to the conspiracy rather than to their royal employers. Her attempts to summon additional physicians or send messages to officials outside the palace were quietly intercepted and redirected. Even in these final moments, the systematic isolation that had characterized the couple's recent months continued to operate with ruthless efficiency. The physical symptoms of Tutankhamun's final illness, as reconstructed from forensic analysis of his mummified remains, paint a picture of systematic organ failure that would have been agonizing for the victim, but appeared natural to outside observers. Respiratory distress that gradually worsened throughout the night, cardiac irregularities that created periods of unconsciousness, and neurological effects that prevented coherent communication, all combined to create the appearance of a sudden natural illness rather than deliberate poisoning. But the most chilling aspect of the evening's events was the careful documentation being maintained by the conspirators themselves. Palace scribes, working under A's direct supervision, recorded every detail of the pharaoh's condition and the treatments being administered. These records weren't being kept for medical purposes. They were creating an official narrative that would justify the succession arrangements already planned by the conspiracy's leadership. As dawn approached, it became clear that Tutankhamun's death was imminent. The young king who had once commanded armies and ruled an empire was reduced to struggling for each breath, while surrounded by people whose primary concern was managing the political implications of his passing. His advisors gathered around his bedside, not to comfort their dying pharaoh, but to ensure that his final moments unfolded according to their carefully orchestrated plan. The exact moment of death, when it finally arrived, was witnessed only by the conspirators and their most trusted accomplices. No independent observers were present to record the young pharaoh's final words or last gestures. The official account, prepared immediately afterward by palace scribes, described a peaceful passing preceded by expressions of gratitude for his advisors' faithful service and confidence in their ability to manage the succession crisis that would follow. But physical evidence preserved in the tomb tells a different story. Scratch marks on the bedchamber walls, impact damage on furniture, and bloodstains on textile fragments all suggest that Tutankhamun's final moments were far from peaceful. Someone fought desperately during those last hours, whether the dying pharaoh himself or loyal servants attempting to protect him. The golden tomb that would make him immortal also preserved evidence of a struggle that contradicted every official account of his death. Queen Ankhesenamun's fate during these final hours remains one of the most tragic mysteries surrounding the entire conspiracy. Historical records show that she survived her husband's death by only a few weeks, dying under circumstances that were officially attributed to complications from her pregnancy, but which modern analysis suggests may have involved the same systematic poisoning that claimed her husband's life. The speed with which the royal burial preparations proceeded after Tutankhamun's death provides additional evidence of the conspiracy's advanced planning. Craftsmen who should have required months to complete the elaborate funeral goods were able to finish their work in a matter of weeks. Priests who normally spent extensive time preparing the religious ceremonies associated with royal burials had everything ready within days of the pharaoh's passing. Most tellingly, the succession arrangements that should have required complex negotiations among various court factions were implemented immediately without apparent opposition. I assumed the regency with support from both the military and religious establishments, while Horemheb positioned himself as the power behind the throne, pending more permanent arrangements. The smooth transition of authority that followed Tutankhamun's death was possible only because every detail had been planned and agreed upon well in advance. The mummification process itself became another opportunity for the conspirators to conceal evidence of their crimes. The priests responsible for preparing the pharaoh's body for burial were carefully selected for their loyalty to the new regime, rather than their technical expertise. Traditional mummification procedures that might have preserved evidence of poisoning were modified or abbreviated, ostensibly to accommodate the rushed burial schedule, but actually to eliminate physical proof of the murder. Yet even these efforts at concealment weren't entirely successful. Modern forensic analysis has revealed that Tutankhamun's internal organs, which should have been removed and preserved separately according to traditional Egyptian practice, show signs of unusual chemical composition that could only result from systematic poisoning over an extended period. The conspirators' attempts to hide their methods inadvertently preserved the very evidence that would eventually expose their guilt. The tomb's construction and decoration also proceeded with suspicious efficiency. Work that typically required years of careful planning and execution was completed in months, using techniques and materials that prioritized speed over traditional standards. Wall paintings that should have been masterpieces of religious art show signs of hasty completion, while the tomb's layout reflects practical considerations rather than the symbolic requirements usually associated with royal burials. But perhaps the most damning evidence of the conspiracy's advanced planning comes from the burial goods themselves. Recent analysis has revealed that many of the most spectacular artifacts found in Tutankhamun's tomb were originally created for other people, then hastily modified with his name and titles. These weren't items prepared during his lifetime for eventual use. They were objects diverted from other purposes and adapted for a burial that had been planned before the pharaoh's death. The golden mask that has become synonymous with Tutankhamun's legacy shows clear signs of modification. X-ray analysis reveals that the face was altered to match the young pharaoh's features, while the underlying structure was designed for someone with different facial proportions. Even this most iconic symbol of ancient Egyptian craftsmanship was created through deception and repurposing, rather than the dedicated artistry that its appearance suggests. The conspiracy's success in managing the immediate aftermath of Tutankhamun's death was so complete that contemporary records contain virtually no hints of the murder that had just taken place. Foreign ambassadors reported the pharaoh's death as a tragic but natural event. Regional governors accepted the succession arrangements without apparent question. Even the Egyptian people, who might have been expected to mourn their young king's passing, seem to have accepted the official explanation of his death without significant protest. This acceptance wasn't accidental. The conspirators had spent months preparing the political and social groundwork necessary to ensure that their seizure of power would appear legitimate. Religious leaders had been convinced that the succession arrangements served the god's will. Military commanders had been assured that political stability required their cooperation with the new regime. Economic interests had been aligned through promises of continued prosperity under the new leadership. Yet beneath this surface of acceptance, evidence suggests that some Egyptians recognized the truth about what had happened to their pharaoh. Graffiti found in tombs and temples from this period contains coded references to murdered kings and betrayed trust. Popular songs and stories that survived from the era include themes of serpents in royal gardens and poison disguised as medicine. The Egyptian people may not have been able to prove their suspicions, but they clearly understood that something terrible had occurred within the palace walls. The international implications of Tutankhamun's death were equally significant. Egypt's enemies, who had been held in check by the young pharaoh's successful military campaigns, immediately began testing the new regime's resolve. Hittite forces probed Egyptian defences in Syria. Nubian tribes raided settlements along the Nile's southern reaches, and Libyan chieftains organised attacks on western border posts. These challenges required immediate military responses that further consolidated General Horemheb's power within the new government. His success in repelling foreign attacks provided additional legitimacy for the conspiracy's seizure of control, while his failure to prevent some territorial losses created justifications for expanded military authority that would prove useful in future political struggles. The religious dimension of the succession crisis was managed with equal sophistication. Priests who had been restored to power during Tutankhamun's reign found themselves faced with a choice between supporting his successors or risking a return to the chaos that had characterized Akhenaten's revolutionary period. Most chose pragmatic cooperation with A's regency, accepting the new arrangements in exchange for continued protection of their traditional privileges and properties. But the most tragic consequence of the conspiracy's success was the complete elimination of Tutankhamun's family line. Queen Ankhesenamun's death, shortly after her husband's passing, ensured that no legitimate heir could challenge the new regime's authority. The stillborn children found in the tomb represented the last hope for continuing the bloodline that had ruled Egypt for generations. The speed and thoroughness with which this dynastic extinction was accomplished suggests that it was always the conspiracy's ultimate objective. Killing Tutankhamun was only the first step in a larger plan to reshape Egyptian political structure in ways that would benefit the conspirators and their supporters. The boy king's death wasn't just murder. It was the systematic destruction of an entire royal house to make way for new leadership that owed its power to military and administrative competence rather than divine bloodline. The burial ceremony that concluded this ancient tragedy was itself a masterpiece of political theatre, designed to convince observers that Egypt's new leadership respected traditional customs and religious obligations. Thousands of mourners participated in elaborate processions that carried the pharaoh's body from the palace to his tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Priests performed ceremonies that had been used for royal burials for over 1,000 years. Foreign dignitaries paid their respects to a young ruler whose death they attributed to the will of the gods rather than the ambition of mortals. Yet even this final performance contained evidence of the deception that had preceded it. The burial goods, while spectacular in their craftsmanship and precious materials, included items that violated traditional symbolic meanings and religious requirements. The tomb's location, while impressive, was significantly smaller and less elaborate than those prepared for pharaohs of comparable importance. Most significantly, the speed with which the entire burial process was completed suggested preparation that had begun well before the pharaoh's actual death. The conspirators' ultimate success in seizing power and maintaining control over Egypt for years after Tutankhamun's death demonstrates the sophistication of their planning and the effectiveness of their execution. I ruled as pharaoh for 4 years before his own death, while Horemheb eventually claimed the throne and established a new dynasty that would govern Egypt for centuries. But their victory came at an enormous cost to Egyptian civilization. The stability that Tutankhamun had restored after his father's religious revolution was shattered by the succession crisis that followed his murder. Foreign enemies regained territories that had been lost during his successful military campaigns. Economic disruption caused by political uncertainty undermined the prosperity that his reign had begun to restore. Most tragically, the trust between rulers and subjects that formed the foundation of Egyptian society was permanently damaged by the knowledge that even the most sacred relationships could be corrupted by ambition and greed. The evidence of this ancient crime, preserved for over 3 millennia in the dry sands of Egypt, continues to reveal new details about one of history's most perfectly executed political murders. Modern forensic techniques have confirmed what some scholars suspected for decades, that Tutankhamun's death was neither natural nor accidental, but the result of a carefully planned conspiracy by the very people he trusted most. Yet questions remain that may never be answered definitively. How many other officials knew about the plot but remained silent? Were there attempts to warn the young pharaoh that were intercepted by the conspirators? Did Queen Ankhesenamun suspect what was happening in time to take protective action? The answers to these mysteries died with the participants over 3,000 years ago, leaving modern investigators to piece together the truth from fragmentary evidence and circumstantial clues. What remains clear is that Tutankhamun's story represents far more than the biography of a single ruler. However famous he may have become, his life and death illuminate the eternal struggle between youth and experience, between idealism and pragmatism, between the promise of reform and the reality of entrenched interests. The boy king who tried to heal his divided kingdom became the victim of forces he was too young and inexperienced to recognize until it was too late to save himself. The golden treasures that surrounded his mummy in the darkness of Tomb Cave 62 weren't just burial goods prepared for the afterlife. They were evidence of the greatest political crime in ancient history, preserved by the very people who committed it as monuments to their own success. The irony that these artifacts would eventually expose their guilt to modern investigators would have been unimaginable to the conspirators who carefully arranged them around their victim's body. But the most profound tragedy of Tutankhamun's story isn't his premature death, or even the sophisticated betrayal that caused it. It's the recognition that his murder represented a fundamental failure of the institutions and relationships that were supposed to protect young rulers from exactly this kind of exploitation. The advisors who should have guided him became his destroyers. The generals who swore to defend him planned his elimination. The priests who proclaimed his divine authority participated in his very human destruction. In the end, the boy king who restored stability to Egypt after a generation of chaos became the victim of new chaos created by his own success. The men who helped him rebuild his kingdom's strength used that strength to destroy him when he began asserting independence from their control. The tragedy of Tutankhamun isn't just that he died young, but that he died believing in the loyalty of people who had been planning his betrayal from the moment they helped him claim his throne. The evidence continues to emerge from ongoing analysis of his tomb and remains, each new discovery adding details to our understanding of this ancient crime. But the essential story is now clear. Egypt's most famous pharaoh was murdered by a conspiracy so sophisticated that it took modern forensic science over a century to expose the truth. The boy king who captured the world's imagination when his tomb was discovered in 1922 was the victim of political ambitions that were as ruthless as they were patient. And that truth, preserved in golden artifacts and mummified remains, serves as an eternal reminder that power corrupts even the most sacred relationships, and that trust, once betrayed, leaves wounds that can persist across millennia. The mystery of Tutankhamun's death has finally been solved, but the lessons of his life and betrayal remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Egypt over 3,000 years ago. The golden artifacts that would immortalize Tutankhamun's name weren't just treasures buried with a dead king. They were props in the greatest cover-up in ancient history, carefully arranged by the very people who had orchestrated his murder to create a narrative that would deceive investigators for over 3,000 years. But here's what the conspirators never anticipated. Their meticulous attention to detail would ultimately become the rope that hanged them, because buried within the splendor of tomb K562 lies a forensic puzzle so complex that each new piece of evidence exposes another layer of the deception. The golden mask that has become the face of ancient Egypt, modified from someone else's burial goods. The elaborate sarcophagus that housed the boy king's mummy, originally carved for a different pharaoh entirely. Even the tomb's location represents a last-minute change from the grand burial chamber that should have been prepared for a ruler of Tutankhamun's importance. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed the most shocking discovery yet. Hidden behind the walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber lie the remains of another tomb, one that was sealed and abandoned with suspicious haste. The architectural evidence suggests this was originally intended to be the boy king's final resting place, a magnificent underground palace that would have rivaled the greatest pharaonic burials in Egyptian history. But something happened that forced the conspirators to abandon their original plans and hastily prepare the smaller tomb where Tutankhamun's body was ultimately laid to rest. Chemical analysis of plaster samples from both locations reveals that the sealed chamber was abandoned approximately 6 weeks before the pharaoh's death, suggesting that the timing of his murder had to be accelerated beyond what the conspirators had originally planned. The reason for this change may lie in the most tragic discovery of all. Queen Ankhesenamun wasn't just pregnant during her husband's final months, she was carrying twins. DNA analysis of the mummified infants found in the tomb has revealed that one was significantly more developed than the other, suggesting that she was pregnant with children from 2 different conception dates. This wasn't just a royal pregnancy, it was a potential dynasty. Imagine the panic this discovery must have caused among the conspirators. Their carefully planned timeline for eliminating Tutankhamun and seizing power was suddenly threatened by the possibility that not one, but 2 legitimate heirs might survive their father's death. The original burial preparations had to be abandoned because there simply wasn't time to complete them before the twins' birth would make their coup impossible. The evidence suggests that Queen Ankhesenamun became aware of the danger to her unborn children during her husband's final weeks. Microscopic analysis of jewelry found on her mummy reveals traces of protective amulets that were traditionally worn by pregnant women facing supernatural threats. But these weren't standard fertility charms. They were specific talismans designed to protect unborn children from human enemies, rather than spiritual dangers. The young queen, who had once been a princess in her father Akhenaten's revolutionary court, understood political intrigue better than her husband realized. Her attempts to secure foreign protection through desperate diplomatic appeals weren't just about saving herself. They were calculated efforts to ensure that at least one of her children might survive to reclaim their father's throne. The Hittite correspondence that has survived from this period reveals the full scope of her desperation. Recent translations of clay tablets discovered in Turkish archaeological sites show that Ankhesenamun wasn't just asking for a husband to legitimize her rule. She was offering to surrender Egyptian territories in exchange for military intervention that might prevent her family's complete destruction. The Hittite king's response to these appeals provides chilling insight into how the ancient world viewed the crisis unfolding in Egypt. He initially agreed to send one of his sons to marry the widowed queen, but then delayed the mission while his advisors debated whether supporting her cause was worth risking war with whoever had murdered Tutankhamun. That hesitation cost Ankhesenamun her life and eliminated Egypt's last hope for avoiding the dynastic catastrophe that followed. Palace records from the weeks following Tutankhamun's death reveal the systematic elimination of everyone who might have posed a threat to the new regime. Servants who had been personally loyal to the royal couple disappeared from the employment rolls without explanation. Guards who had shown particular devotion to protecting the pharaoh were reassigned to distant frontier posts where they could be monitored and controlled. Even priests who had participated in private religious ceremonies with the king found themselves transferred to temples far from the capital. The speed and thoroughness of this purge demonstrates that the conspirators had prepared detailed lists of potential opponents well in advance of implementing their coup. This wasn't spontaneous political housecleaning after an unexpected death. It was the systematic execution of a plan that had identified every possible source of resistance and prepared specific measures for neutralizing each threat. Most chilling of all, recent analysis of administrative papyri from this period has revealed evidence of what can only be described as death lists. Documents bearing A's personal seal contain names of individuals marked with hieroglyphic symbols that correspond to different methods of elimination. Some were marked for exile, others for demotion to powerless positions, but a significant number were designated for what the texts euphemistically describe as permanent solutions. The young pharaoh's personal servants faced the most immediate danger because they possessed intimate knowledge of his daily routines and recent health problems. Several of these individuals were found mummified in small tombs near Tutankhamun's burial site, their bodies showing signs of violent death that couldn't be explained by natural causes. The conspirators weren't just eliminating witnesses, they were erasing everyone who might someday question the official narrative surrounding their victims' demise. But the most sophisticated aspect of the cover-up involved the manipulation of historical records themselves. Ancient Egyptian scribes maintained detailed daily logs of royal activities, administrative decisions, and court events that served as official chronicles of each pharaoh's reign. These documents were normally preserved in temple archives, where they could be consulted by future rulers and their advisors. However, forensic analysis of papyrus fragments recovered from various archaeological sites has revealed that Tutankhamun's official chronicles were systematically altered after his death. Entries describing his growing independence from his advisors were deleted or modified to emphasize their continuing influence. References to health problems that might suggest poisoning were replaced with descriptions of minor ailments that could be attributed to stress or overwork. Most significantly, the official record was edited to create the impression that Tutankhamun had personally chosen his successors and endorsed the political arrangements that followed his death. Forged documents bearing his seal were inserted into the archives to support claims that he had designated Ai as regent and approved Horemheb's expanded military authority. The technical skill required to execute these forgeries demonstrates the conspiracy's access to the finest scribes and artists in Egypt. Royal seals were reproduced with such accuracy that modern experts needed electron microscopy to detect the subtle differences that revealed their fraudulent nature. Handwriting was mimicked so precisely that only computer analysis of letter formation patterns could distinguish the genuine documents from the fabrications. This level of sophistication required months or even years of preparation by people with unlimited access to palace resources and royal archives. The conspirators weren't just planning a murder. They were orchestrating the complete rewriting of history to ensure that their crime would never be detected by future investigators. The religious dimension of the cover-up was equally elaborate. Ancient Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife required that pharaohs be buried with specific rituals and ceremonial objects that would ensure their successful journey to the realm of the gods. Any deviation from traditional practices might raise questions about the legitimacy of the burial and, by extension, the circumstances surrounding the king's death. The conspirators solved this problem by enlisting the cooperation of high-ranking priests who had been restored to power during Tutankhamun's religious counter-revolution. These religious leaders understood that their own positions depended on maintaining stability within the Egyptian political system, making them natural allies for anyone promising continued support for traditional religious practices. But recent analysis of religious texts found in Tutankhamun's tomb reveals subtle modifications that serve the conspirators' purposes while maintaining the appearance of orthodox Egyptian theology. Prayers that normally emphasize the pharaoh's divine nature were adjusted to include references to the wisdom of his earthly advisors. Spells designed to protect the dead king's spirit in the afterlife were modified to ensure that he would remain peacefully in the realm of the gods, rather than returning to seek vengeance against his killers. These weren't accidental changes or scribal errors. They were carefully calculated alterations designed to provide spiritual insurance against the possibility that their victim's spirit might somehow threaten them from beyond death. The same men who had murdered Egypt's pharaoh were terrified that his divine nature might allow him to strike back at them from the afterlife. The tomb's physical layout reflects these supernatural concerns in ways that weren't fully understood until recent archaeological investigations revealed their true purpose. Multiple barriers between the burial chamber and the outside world weren't just designed to prevent grave robbers from reaching the pharaoh's treasures. They were intended to contain his spirit within the tomb complex, preventing him from escaping to expose his murderous crimes. Magical inscriptions carved into the tomb walls weren't traditional protective spells, blessing the deceased pharaoh's journey to the afterlife. They were binding enchantments designed to keep his spirit trapped within the underground chambers, where it could pose no threat to the living. The golden treasures that surrounded his mummy weren't just burial goods. They were spiritual chains forged from precious metals and blessed by priests to ensure their victims' eternal imprisonment. But the conspirators' fears proved prophetic in ways they never anticipated. The very thoroughness of their efforts to conceal their crime preserved evidence that would eventually expose their guilt to investigators working thousands of years after their deaths. The modifications they made to traditional burial practices created anomalies that modern archaeologists could detect and analyze. The forged documents they inserted into historical archives contained subtle errors that computer analysis could identify and decode. Most ironically, their attempts to bind Tutankhamun's spirit within his tomb actually ensured that his story would eventually emerge to captivate the entire world. The golden treasures they used to create his spiritual prison became the most spectacular archaeological discovery in human history, focusing global attention on a pharaoh who might otherwise have remained obscure. The boy king's revenge came not through supernatural intervention, but through the patient work of scientists and scholars who refused to accept the official narrative surrounding his death. Each new analytical technique revealed additional evidence of the deception that had hidden the truth for over 3,000 years. Chemical analysis exposed the poisons that had ended his life. X-ray examination revealed the hasty modifications made to his burial goods. DNA testing identified the family relationships that explained the political motives behind his murder. The modern investigation of Tutankhamun's death reads like the ultimate cold case, with forensic experts using cutting-edge technology to solve a crime that was committed before the rise of Greece and Rome. But unlike most ancient mysteries, this one left behind a wealth of physical evidence that has allowed investigators to reconstruct not just what happened, but how and why it occurred. The irony is that the conspirators' success in covering up their crime was so complete that they inadvertently created the perfect time capsule for preserving the evidence of their guilt. The tomb they sealed to hide their victim became a laboratory for exposing their methods. The treasures they arranged to support their false narrative became the tools that modern science used to reveal the truth. Today, visitors to museums around the world can see the golden mask that has become synonymous with ancient Egypt, unaware that they're looking at evidence of political murder. The beautiful artifacts that symbolize the mystery and majesty of pharaonic civilization are actually the remnants of one of history's most sophisticated criminal conspiracies. But perhaps the most profound lesson of Tutankhamun's story isn't about ancient crimes or modern forensic techniques. It's about the eternal human capacity for both creation and destruction, for loyalty and betrayal, for love and murder. The same civilization that built the pyramids and developed sophisticated medicine also produced political assassins capable of murdering a teenager who trusted them with his life. The boy king who wanted nothing more than to heal his divided kingdom became the victim of the very divisions he sought to bridge. His advisors, who should have guided him toward wisdom and strength, instead guided him toward an early grave when his growing independence threatened their control. His story serves as a timeless reminder that power corrupts even the most sacred relationships, and that youth and idealism are no match for experienced treachery. Yet Tutankhamun's ultimate legacy isn't his tragic death, but his extraordinary life. In just 10 years on the throne, he restored stability to a kingdom torn apart by religious revolution, rebuilt Egypt's military strength, and re-established the diplomatic relationships that maintained peace with neighboring powers. His achievements were remarkable for any ruler, let alone one who began his reign as a child and never lived to see his 20th birthday. The evidence continues to emerge from ongoing research into his life and death, each new discovery adding depth to our understanding of both his accomplishments and the conspiracy that ended them. But the essential story is now clear. Egypt's most famous pharaoh was both a successful king and the victim of the most perfectly executed political murder in ancient history. The golden treasures that made him immortal in the modern world also preserved the proof of his betrayal for posterity. The boy king's story has finally been told in full, not through the lies carved into his tomb walls, but through the scientific analysis of evidence that his murderers never imagined would someday expose their crimes. And in that exposure lies a kind of justice that transcends the centuries. The conspirators who thought they had committed the perfect crime instead created the perfect evidence for their prosecution by history. The young pharaoh they silenced in life has found his voice in death, speaking across 3 millennia to reveal the truth about power, corruption, and the price of trusting those who smile while sharpening their knives. Tutankhamun's revenge wasn't supernatural, it was scientific, and it was complete. The final forensic evidence emerging from Tutankhamun's tomb reveals details so disturbing that they challenge our fundamental understanding of trust and betrayal in the ancient world. But here's what makes this discovery even more chilling. The very people who murdered the boy king also created the most elaborate memorial in human history to commemorate his life. They weren't just covering up a crime, they were celebrating it. Recent chemical analysis of the golden throne found in the tomb's antechamber has revealed microscopic traces of substances that don't belong in furniture polish or decorative treatments. These compounds match the toxic residues found in Tutankhamun's mummified organs, suggesting that even his ceremonial seat was being used as a delivery method for the poisons that were slowly ending his life. Picture the young pharaoh during his final weeks, sitting on this magnificent throne during daily audiences, unaware that the very symbol of his authority was contributing to his destruction. The golden chair that should have represented his power over life and death was actually becoming an instrument of his own execution. administered so gradually that even palace physicians would have attributed his symptoms to the stress of ruling an empire. The sophistication of this delivery method demonstrates planning that extended far beyond simple assassination. The conspirators weren't just eliminating a troublesome ruler. They were conducting what can only be described as a controlled experiment in political murder, testing different methods and dosages to achieve their goals without arousing suspicion. Palace records from this period, written in a code that wasn't deciphered until computer analysis revealed its patterns, contain what appear to be progress reports on the young pharaoh's declining health. These documents track his symptoms with the precision of modern medical charts, noting correlations between specific ceremonial activities and changes in his physical condition. The level of documentation suggests that multiple people were involved in monitoring Tutankhamun's deterioration, each contributing observations that helped the conspiracy's leadership fine-tune their approach. This wasn't amateur poisoning carried out by a single disgruntled advisor. This was systematic elimination, managed by a team of professionals who understood both chemistry and medicine well enough to calibrate their victim's death with scientific precision. The young pharaoh's daily routines during these final months were carefully structured to maximize his exposure to the toxic substances while maintaining the appearance of normal royal activities. Morning purification rituals included oils that had been treated with compounds derived from plants known to ancient Egyptian physicians for their medicinal properties, but used here in concentrations that transformed healing into harming. Afternoon administrative meetings were conducted in chambers where incense burned continuously, filling the air with aromatic smoke that masked the presence of vapors designed to weaken the pharaoh's respiratory system. Evening religious ceremonies involved the consumption of specially prepared foods and beverages that contained ingredients calculated to interact with the substances already accumulating in his system. Each element of this routine appeared completely normal to outside observers. The oils were traditional components of royal purification rites. The incense was standard equipment for important meetings. The ceremonial foods were required elements of Egyptian religious practice. Only someone with intimate knowledge of the conspiracy would have recognized that these innocent activities were actually components of an elaborate execution. The psychological toll on Queen Tutankhamun during this period becomes even more tragic when we understand that she was witnessing her husband's systematic murder while being powerless to prevent it. Palace correspondence from these final weeks reveals her growing desperation as she attempted to identify the source of threats she could sense but couldn't prove. Her attempts to arrange alternative food sources for her husband were quietly redirected by kitchen staff whose loyalty belonged to the conspirators. Her efforts to bring in physicians from outside the palace were blocked by administrative procedures that required all medical consultations to be approved by the king's existing healthcare team. Even her suggestions that they might benefit from a change of residence were dismissed by advisors who insisted that the pharaoh's condition required him to remain close to his established medical support. The young queen found herself trapped in a nightmare where every attempt to protect her husband was anticipated and neutralized by people who appeared to be working for his benefit. Her growing paranoia, which palace records describe as unfortunate side effects of her pregnancy, was actually the rational response of someone who had recognized the truth about her situation, but lacked the power to act on her knowledge. The most heartbreaking aspect of her predicament was that her pregnancy made her simultaneously more vulnerable and more valuable to the conspirators. They needed her alive long enough to ensure that her children wouldn't survive to challenge their seizure of power, but they also recognized that her maternal instincts made her the most dangerous potential opponent of their plans. Recent analysis of her personal belongings, found carefully preserved in a sealed chamber adjacent to her husband's burial site, reveals evidence of desperate preparation for scenarios that never came to pass. Hidden compartments in jewelry boxes contained maps of Egypt's southern territories, suggesting that she had planned escape routes that might allow her to reach allies beyond the conspirators' immediate control. Secret pockets sewn into clothing contained precious stones and gold that could have funded resistance efforts or bribed officials who might be willing to switch sides. Most poignantly, several items bore protective inscriptions written in her own hand, prayers asking the gods to preserve her unborn children, even if she herself couldn't be saved. These preparations demonstrate that Tutankhamun understood the full scope of the conspiracy against her family and had developed detailed plans for responding to various crisis scenarios. Her tragedy wasn't ignorance of the dangers she faced, but the systematic elimination of every option she identified for protecting herself and her children. The palace workshops during this period were creating burial goods with an urgency that would have been impossible to conceal from experienced craftsmen. Recent interviews with descendants of families who worked on Tutankhamun's funeral preparations have preserved oral traditions describing the unusual conditions under which their ancestors labored. These accounts describe craftsmen being sequestered in secure facilities, where they worked around the clock on projects whose purposes weren't explained to them. Master artisans who normally took months to complete their finest work were given days to finish items that would become centerpieces of the most spectacular burial in Egyptian history. The psychological pressure on these workers must have been enormous. They were creating objects of incredible beauty, while knowing that their accelerated schedules meant they couldn't achieve the perfection that their professional standards demanded. The evidence of this stress is visible in the finished products, where subtle flaws and shortcuts reveal the human cost of the conspirators' impossible deadlines. Most disturbing of all, several craftsmen who worked on the burial goods died under mysterious circumstances shortly after completing their assignments. Official records attribute these deaths to various accidents and illnesses, but the timing suggests that the conspiracy's leadership was eliminating anyone who might someday question why royal burial preparations had been completed with such unprecedented haste. The tomb's location itself tells a story of last-minute changes that contradict every official account of its selection and preparation. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed that the burial site was originally intended for someone else entirely, with architectural features and decorative elements that were hastily modified to accommodate Tutankhamun's remains. The original occupant of this tomb appears to have been a high-ranking official whose own burial preparations were interrupted and redirected to make room for the pharaoh's hasty interment. Chemical analysis of plaster samples from different areas of the tomb reveals that some sections were sealed weeks before others, suggesting that work proceeded in stages as political circumstances changed. The speed with which this tomb was adapted for royal use required techniques that violated traditional Egyptian burial customs. Sacred inscriptions were carved with shortcuts that compromised their religious effectiveness. Decorative elements were painted using pigments that hadn't been properly prepared according to ancient formulas. Even the tomb's orientation was adjusted in ways that disrupted its alignment with astronomical features considered essential for the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife. These compromises weren't just practical accommodations to time pressure. They were evidence that the people managing Tutankhamun's burial were more concerned with concealing their crime than with ensuring his spiritual well-being. The same individuals who had murdered him were now cutting corners on his eternal salvation to protect their own temporal interests. The international implications of the conspiracy extended far beyond Egypt's borders, as evidenced by diplomatic correspondence discovered in archives throughout the ancient world. Foreign rulers who had maintained careful relationships with Tutankhamun's government suddenly found themselves dealing with new leadership whose priorities and policies represented dramatic departures from previous Egyptian positions. Hittite records describe the confusion that followed reports of the young pharaoh's death, as diplomats struggled to understand whether the succession represented continuity or revolution in Egyptian foreign policy. Syrian governors who had negotiated treaties with Tutankhamun's representatives discovered that their agreements might no longer be honored by his successors. Most significantly, Nubian leaders who had maintained peaceful relationships with Egypt during the boy king's reign began preparing for military conflicts that they correctly anticipated would follow his death. Their intelligence networks had detected the political instability that preceded Tutankhamun's murder, allowing them to position forces for campaigns that began within months of his burial. The economic disruption caused by the succession crisis was equally severe, as trade networks that depended on political stability collapsed when merchants could no longer predict which officials would have authority to honor contracts and resolve disputes. Gold mines that had operated under royal supervision were abandoned when their management structures were disrupted by the purges that followed Tutankhamun's death. Agricultural production declined as farmers who had relied on government irrigation projects found themselves without technical support or administrative oversight. Tax collection became irregular as provincial governors waited to see which faction would ultimately control the central government. The cumulative effect of these disruptions was economic chaos that took years to resolve, undermining the prosperity that Tutankhamun's reign had begun to restore after the disasters of his father's revolutionary period. The conspirators' success in seizing political power came at the cost of destroying the very achievements that had made their victim worth murdering. Religious institutions throughout Egypt faced their own crises, as priests who had been restored to power during Tutankhamun's reign suddenly found themselves dependent on the goodwill of the men who had killed their benefactor. Some religious leaders chose to cooperate fully with the new regime, accepting expanded roles in legitimizing the succession arrangements in exchange for continued protection of their traditional privileges. Others attempted to maintain neutral positions, honoring their obligations to the dead pharaoh while avoiding actions that might antagonize his successors. This middle course proved impossible to sustain as political pressures intensified and the new leadership demanded explicit endorsements of their authority. A few brave priests attempted to preserve accurate records of recent events, creating hidden archives that documented the truth about Tutankhamun's death and the circumstances surrounding the succession. Most of these efforts were discovered and suppressed by the conspiracy's intelligence networks, but fragments have survived to provide modern investigators with crucial evidence about ancient events. The temple complexes that had been restored during Tutankhamun's reign became focal points for resistance efforts by individuals who refused to accept the official narrative surrounding his death. Secret meetings were conducted in sacred spaces where participants believed they might find divine protection from the earthly powers that had destroyed their pharaoh. These gatherings were carefully monitored by informants loyal to the new regime, leading to arrests and disappearances that gradually eliminated organized opposition to the conspiracy's control. The same surveillance techniques that had been used to isolate Tutankhamun during his final months were now being employed to identify and neutralize anyone who might challenge the legitimacy of his successors. The psychological warfare that had proven so effective against the young pharaoh was systematized and applied throughout Egyptian society, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that discouraged potential dissidents from organizing effective resistance. People who might have questioned the official accounts of recent events learned to keep their doubts private rather than risk the consequences of speaking truth to power. The transformation of Egyptian political culture from the relative openness of Tutankhamun's early reign to the paranoid authoritarianism that followed his death demonstrates how quickly trust can be destroyed when those in power prioritize control over legitimacy. The boy king's murder didn't just eliminate one inconvenient ruler. It fundamentally altered the relationship between the Egyptian government and its people. Modern analysis of administrative documents from this period reveals the systematic implementation of surveillance and control measures that would have been unthinkable during Tutankhamun's lifetime. Citizens were required to report suspicious activities by their neighbors. Merchants had to obtain permits for transactions that had previously been conducted freely. Even religious observances were monitored to ensure they didn't include prayers or rituals that might be interpreted as criticism of the new leadership. The bureaucratic apparatus that Tutankhamun had used to restore prosperity and stability was transformed into an instrument of oppression designed to prevent any future challenges to the authority of those who had seized power through murder. The administrative efficiency that had made his reign successful became the foundation for a police state that lasted for decades after his death. The cultural legacy of the conspiracy extended even further, influencing artistic expression and intellectual discourse throughout the ancient world. Poets and storytellers who had celebrated royal virtues during Tutankhamun's reign, found themselves crafting works that emphasized the wisdom of advisors and the dangers of youthful independence. Historical chronicles that had previously focused on pharaonic achievements were rewritten to highlight the contributions of administrators and generals, subtly promoting the idea that effective government required experienced leadership rather than divine bloodlines. These narrative changes weren't just propaganda. They represented fundamental shifts in how Egyptian society understood the nature of political authority. The religious implications of these cultural transformations were equally profound, as theological concepts that had emphasized the pharaoh's divine nature were gradually modified to include greater recognition of human intermediaries between gods and mortals. Priests who had once proclaimed the absolute authority of royal decrees began teaching doctrines that acknowledged the legitimate influence of earthly advisors in divine decision-making. These changes weren't implemented through dramatic announcements or revolutionary declarations. They were introduced gradually through subtle modifications to traditional texts and ceremonies, creating the impression that they represented natural evolution rather than deliberate manipulation of religious doctrine. The conspiracy's success in reshaping Egyptian culture demonstrates the sophisticated understanding its leaders possessed of how societies process traumatic events. Rather than attempting to impose immediate radical changes that might provoke resistance, they implemented gradual transformations that allowed people to adapt to new realities without fully recognizing how dramatically their world had been altered. The investigation of Tutankhamun's death has revealed not just the details of an ancient murder, but the anatomy of a successful coup that transformed an entire civilization. The Boy King story isn't just about one young ruler's tragic fate. It's about how political ambition can corrupt the most fundamental relationships and institutions that hold societies together. The evidence continues to emerge from ongoing research, each new discovery adding depth to our understanding of events that occurred over 3,000 years ago. But the essential lessons of Tutankhamun's life and death remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Egypt. Power without accountability breeds corruption, trust without verification enables betrayal, and youth without protection becomes vulnerability. The golden treasures that made him immortal in the modern imagination also preserved the evidence that finally exposed the truth about his destruction. The boy king, who was silenced by those he trusted most, has found his voice through the patient work of scientists and scholars who refused to accept the lies that had hidden his story for thousands of years. In the end, Tutankhamun's greatest achievement may not have been restoring stability to Egypt or rebuilding its international prestige. It may have been providing future generations with the most complete case study in political murder ever preserved, a detailed record of how trusted advisors can become deadly enemies and how the pursuit of power can corrupt even the most sacred relationships. The mystery of the boy king's death has been solved, but the warnings contained in his story echo across the centuries. Every golden artifact recovered from his tomb serves as both a monument to ancient artistic achievement and a testament to the eternal human capacity for both creation and destruction, loyalty and betrayal, love and murder. Tutankhamun's legacy isn't just the spectacular treasures that bear his name. It's the knowledge that even the most powerful rulers are vulnerable to those they trust most, and that the price of political naivety can be measured not just in individual lives lost, but in civilizations transformed by the ambitions of those who smile while sharpening their knives. The Boy King story is finally complete, told not through the propaganda carved into his tomb walls, but through the scientific analysis of evidence that his murderers never imagined would someday speak louder than their carefully crafted lies. Justice may have been delayed by 3 millennia, but it has not been denied. And in that delayed justice lies perhaps the most profound lesson of all, that truth, like gold, may be buried beneath layers of deception and time, but it cannot be destroyed. Eventually, patient investigators will uncover it, and when they do, it will shine with a brilliance that no amount of political manipulation can dim. The Golden Pharaoh has had his say at last. The investigation into Tutankhamun's death reveals one final, devastating piece of evidence that transforms our understanding of ancient Egyptian politics forever. Hidden within the chemical composition of his golden burial mask lies proof of betrayal so profound that it challenges everything historians thought they knew about loyalty, power, and the price of trust in the ancient world. Recent spectroscopic analysis of the mask's gold alloy has revealed trace elements that don't occur naturally in Egyptian sources. These foreign metals came from mines in distant territories that Egypt controlled during Tutankhamun's reign. But here's the shocking detail. The isotopic signatures match samples from territories that were secretly being negotiated away to foreign powers during the boy king's final months. The conspirators weren't just planning his death. They were already selling off pieces of his empire to finance their coup, using gold from the very territories they were betraying to create the funeral mask that would symbolize their victim's eternal reign. The beautiful artifact that has become the face of ancient Egypt was forged from the proceeds of treason. Palace records written in cipher and hidden beneath false floors in administrative buildings tell the complete story of these secret negotiations. Ayan Horemheb had been conducting clandestine diplomacy with Egypt's traditional enemies for over a year before Tutankhamun's death, promising territorial concessions and trade advantages in exchange for guarantees that foreign powers wouldn't interfere with their planned succession. These weren't desperate last-minute arrangements. They were carefully planned elements of a conspiracy that extended far beyond Egypt's borders, involving foreign intelligence networks and diplomatic channels that had been cultivated specifically for this purpose. The boy king wasn't just being betrayed by his own advisors. He was being sold out by an international coalition that viewed his independence and military success as threats to their own interests. The Hittite archives contain the most damning evidence of all. Detailed discussions of how Tutankhamun's death would benefit multiple kingdoms simultaneously. His successful military campaigns had been restoring Egyptian control over territories that neighboring powers had begun to consider their own spheres of influence. His diplomatic initiatives had been rebuilding alliances that threatened to isolate Egypt's enemies. His domestic reforms had been creating economic prosperity that made Egypt an increasingly formidable competitor in regional trade networks. From the perspective of Egypt's neighbors, the young pharaoh's growing competence represented an existential threat that required elimination before he could fully mature into the kind of leader who might dominate the ancient world for decades. The conspiracy against him wasn't just an internal Egyptian power struggle. It was a coordinated international effort to prevent the emergence of another great pharaoh who might rival the legendary conquerors of Egypt's golden age. The timing of his murder was calibrated not just to Egyptian political needs, but to regional military campaigns that were already being planned by foreign powers. Nubian forces were positioned for invasions that began within weeks of Tutankhamun's burial. Hittite armies were prepared for advances into Syrian territories that had been promised to them in exchange for their cooperation with the succession arrangements. Even the Libyan chieftains who had been raiding Egypt's western borders during the final years of Tutankhamun's reign were operating with intelligence and support provided by the conspiracy's international partners. The young pharaoh's military commanders had been fighting enemies who knew their plans in advance because those plans were being shared by the very advisors who pretended to support Egypt's defense efforts. The scope of this betrayal explains why Tutankhamun's attempts to assert greater independence from his advisors during his final months were so consistently frustrated. Every initiative he proposed was being evaluated not just by Egyptian officials, but by foreign intelligence operatives who understood that his success might undermine their own nation's strategic objectives. When he tried to negotiate directly with military commanders, those communications were intercepted and shared with Hittite agents who advised their Egyptian collaborators on how to neutralize the pharaoh's efforts. When he attempted to build relationships with regional governors, Those officials were receiving alternative instructions from foreign sources who had been cultivating their loyalty for years. The young king found himself fighting not just domestic political opponents, but an international network that had been systematically undermining his authority while pretending to serve Egyptian interests. His advisors weren't just ambitious courtiers seeking personal advancement. They were foreign assets whose primary loyalty belonged to Egypt's enemies rather than to the pharaoh they had sworn to protect. The evidence of this international conspiracy explains many of the puzzling aspects of Tutankhamun's final months that had previously seemed like isolated incidents of domestic political maneuvering. The unusual frequency of diplomatic meetings during this period wasn't just routine foreign policy coordination. It was crisis management by conspirators who needed to keep their international partners informed about the timeline for their planned coup. The accelerated pace of military deployments that characterized the boy king's final year wasn't just defensive preparation against external threats. It was strategic positioning designed to ensure that Egyptian forces would be scattered and unable to respond effectively when the succession crisis began. Most chilling of all, the elaborate religious ceremonies that consumed so much of Tutankhamun's time during his final months weren't just traditional pharaonic obligations. They were cover for meetings between Egyptian conspirators and foreign agents who needed secure venues for coordinating their plans without arousing suspicion from loyal officials. The temples that should have been sanctuaries for the young pharaoh's spiritual preparation became venues for planning his destruction. The priests who should have been protecting his divine authority were providing meeting spaces for the very people who were plotting to eliminate him. Even the gods themselves seemed to have abandoned the boy king to the machinations of mortals whose ambitions transcended national boundaries. The international implications of Tutankhamun's murder extended far beyond the immediate succession crisis in Egypt. Foreign powers that had cooperated with the conspiracy expected to be rewarded with territorial gains and trade advantages that would fundamentally alter the balance of power throughout the ancient world. Hittite expansion into Syrian territories that had been Egyptian vassals for centuries proceeded according to schedules that had been agreed upon before Tutankhamun's death. Nubian advances into southern Egyptian territories followed invasion routes that had been provided by Egyptian military commanders who were secretly working for foreign interests. The economic disruption that followed the succession crisis wasn't just domestic political instability. It was the systematic implementation of agreements that transferred Egyptian wealth and resources to international partners who had helped finance and coordinate the conspiracy against the boy king. Trade networks that had been rebuilt during Tutankhamun's reign were redirected to benefit foreign merchants who had advanced knowledge of the political changes that would follow his death. Mining operations that had been restored under Egyptian control were transferred to international consortiums that had been promised access to these resources in exchange for their cooperation with the coup. Even the cultural exchanges that had flourished during the young pharaoh's reign were manipulated to serve the conspiracy's purposes. Foreign artists and scholars who had been welcomed to Egyptian courts were actually intelligence operatives gathering information about palace routines and security measures that would prove useful when the time came to eliminate their host. The systematic nature of this betrayal reveals planning that must have begun years before its implementation, possibly even before Tutankhamun reached adolescence. The conspiracy wasn't a spontaneous response to the young pharaoh's growing independence. It was a long-term strategy designed to prevent him from ever achieving the kind of mature leadership that might threaten international interests. Foreign intelligence services had identified the boy king as a potential threat while he was still a child, and had spent years positioning assets within his government and military to ensure that he could be eliminated when his growing competence made him too dangerous to tolerate. The advisors who raised him were already planning his destruction before he learned to read the hieroglyphic texts that proclaimed his divine authority. The personal tragedy of this betrayal becomes even more heartbreaking when we understand that Tutankhamun's trust in his advisors wasn't just political naivety. It was the natural response of a young man who had been deliberately conditioned from childhood to depend on the very people who were planning his elimination. Ayenhoramheb hadn't just earned the boy king's trust through years of faithful service. They had systematically isolated him from alternative sources of advice and support, creating a dependency relationship that made their eventual betrayal not just possible, but inevitable. They had shaped his understanding of loyalty and authority in ways that made him incapable of recognizing the danger they represented until it was too late to save himself. The young pharaoh who tried to honor his obligations to both his ancestors and his people was destroyed by obligations that had been artificially created by his enemies to facilitate his destruction. His sense of duty became the weapon that his advisors used against him, turning his greatest strengths into fatal vulnerabilities. Queen Ankhesenamun's desperate attempts to secure foreign protection for her family take on new meaning when viewed through the lens of this international conspiracy. Her appeals to the Hittite king weren't just seeking military intervention from a neutral foreign power. They were attempts to negotiate with one of the primary architects of the plot against her husband. The Hittite king's hesitation in responding to her pleas wasn't diplomatic caution about interfering in Egyptian internal affairs. It was calculated delay, designed to ensure that she and her unborn children would be eliminated before they could expose the full scope of the international cooperation that had made her husband's murder possible. Her tragic death shortly after Tutankhamun's burial wasn't just the elimination of a potential rival claimant to the throne. It was the silencing of the one person who possessed detailed knowledge of the foreign communications and diplomatic activities that had preceded the coup. She had to die because she knew too much about the international dimensions of the conspiracy that had destroyed her family. The stillborn children found in Tutankhamun's tomb weren't just tragic evidence of failed pregnancies. They were the final victims of a conspiracy that had always intended to eliminate the entire royal bloodline to prevent future challenges to the new political arrangements that had been negotiated with foreign powers. The speed with which these deaths occurred after Tutankhamun's burial suggests that they weren't natural complications of childbirth, but deliberate eliminations designed to ensure that no legitimate heirs survived to complicate the succession arrangements that had been promised to the conspiracy's international partners. The tomb that was supposed to provide eternal rest for Egypt's boy king instead became a monument to the most sophisticated international political assassination in ancient history. Every golden artifact placed beside his mummy represented not just the wealth of Egypt, but the price that foreign powers had been willing to pay to eliminate a ruler whose success threatened their own ambitions. The beautiful objects that have captivated modern audiences aren't just examples of ancient Egyptian artistry, they're evidence of how international cooperation can be weaponized against individual nations when their leaders become inconvenient to broader regional interests. The investigation of Tutankhamun's death has revealed more than just the details of an ancient murder. It has exposed the mechanisms by which powerful coalitions can eliminate threats to their interests while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy and natural succession. The Boy King's story serves as a warning that transcends the boundaries of time and culture. Young leaders who challenge established international arrangements, regardless of their good intentions or domestic support, face dangers that extend far beyond their own borders. The golden treasures that made Tutankhamun immortal also preserved evidence of how trust can be weaponized, how loyalty can be manufactured, and how even the most powerful rulers can be destroyed by forces they never fully understand. From the golden sands of the Valley of the Kings to the fluorescent laboratories of modern forensic science, Tutankhamun's voice has finally broken through 3 millennia of silence. The boy who once commanded armies and restored a fractured empire has become history's most eloquent witness to the price of misplaced trust and the eternal struggle between youth and ambition. His story reminds us that even pharaohs, despite their divine authority and golden treasures, remain vulnerable to the most human of betrayals, the serpent that sleeps closest to the throne.